Our guest today doesn't really need much introduction. I should start by saying he's the only elected official to ever be invited back twice. And I didn't say accept, I said invited. Senator Kirk Watson was elected, as most of you know, in 2006 to represent the Senate district here in Austin. He has become a leader in the Senate, despite being one of the more junior members. And he's here today to, originally when we talked, he said he was going to come and talk about legislative prospects for the upcoming session. In between the time that we arranged this appearance and today, obviously the budget has really taken front seat and everything. Senator Watson has been very outspoken about that over the weekend in the Statesman, and I'm hoping I'm not going to steal a line you've already prepared. But I really enjoyed this. He was asked in an interview with the Statesman over the weekend about budget reform. He was describing the urgency and the political possibility of actually structurally reforming the budget process in the state, which I'm sure he'll talk about. And he said, the scar tissue of some bad practices has built up and is so dense that it's not the kind of thing that you can responsibly do away with overnight. It's going to require a weaning off of these practices to avoid really significant crisis. It has to happen in order to be honest with Texans, but we have to do it in a smart way. I'm hoping today we'll hear a lot about that smart way. Please join me in welcoming Senator Kirk Watson.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much, and I appreciate the chance that I get to be with you all today. I am going to talk about the budget, and I'm going to kind of lay out where I think we are on the budget and where I think we ought to go on the budget. And it's true that I have been talking about it for some time now, that I really think that 2011, this legislative session that's coming up, is a session where we can go about making some budget reforms that are really meaningful to Texans. I actually think that 2011 sets itself up as a time where we can really restore some stability to the Texas budget. And by doing that, we can also focus on creating greater security for all Texans. And I know I'm talking to a group of young people here, and I'll come back to that. And if I don't, somebody needs to ask me and say, why didn't you get back to that? But I want to talk to you specifically a little bit, because I really do believe that part of the security we're talking about, part of the stability that we're talking about, and the accountability is going to be something that's going to become very, very important to your generation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. But the truth of the matter is that for years, those that have been in control of our budget have made promises to Texans that they would run government like a business. Well, they aren't. And the current business model, and to use the language of business, the business model that we're operating under is failing, in my opinion. And the most obvious test of a business model is to look at that business's budget. The budget in the state of Texas has become harder and harder to balance in a sustainable way. It's become less stable over time, and it's increasingly resistant as a result of that to proposals that are patently good for Texans and for the Texas economy. So in my view, the first step toward meeting the immediate needs of our Texas families and planning and preparing for Texas's future has to be that we fix the budgeting process so that the voters and the people of Texas can truly understand how their money's being spent, what investments the state needs, and really what those investments would cost them. So, in my view, legislators shouldn't support short-term budget balancing tactics, whether they be raids on the rainy day fund, devastating budget cuts to necessities, fiscal gimmicks, or new taxes or fees, until those that are in control of the budget process commit to meaningful budget accountability and reform. So that starts with the question, because everybody's reading about it in the newspaper. How deep is the hole? How big is the budget shortfall that we're going to be facing when we convene on January 11th, 2011? Well, some estimates project it to be in the $20 billion range. The shortfall will be in the $20 billion range. You're starting to hear whispering that it'll be more like $24 billion, or it could be as high as $28 billion. Some say it's, well, no, it's only 10 or 11 billion. The idea that we can put the word only in front of 10 or 11 billion is pretty phenomenal, but some people are saying that. The truth of the matter is, we just don't really know yet how deep the hole is. And frankly, I think that's one of the symptoms of a business model that doesn't really work. The idea that we could be going into a legislative session and not know how deep the hole really is within some measure of certainty. Many of you may know that back at the end of this last fiscal year, at the end of August and beginning of September, on September 1st, I sent a letter to the Comptroller of Public Accounts, and who's effectively the state's CFO. And I said, why don't we get an updated revenue estimate? We need to have an updated revenue estimate so we'll know what we're going into. I asked for a financial forecast. I asked for information related to our debt and the situation with our debt. I asked for information on what I consider to be a failure of our state's business tax. I asked for information related to our cash management committee, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Status of the rainy day fund and the status of dedicated funds. Instead of responding, frankly, I think it's simply an appropriate business practice to give a revenue estimate, to keep an updated revenue estimate. But I was told we're not going to do that until after the legislature convenes. I'll be honest, I think we're probably required to have that under the Texas Constitution. I actually cited a provision in the Texas Constitution that says supplemental statements shall be submitted at any special session of the legislature and at such other times as may be necessary to show probable changes. Well, there have been probable changes. We are all talking about those probable changes, but yet we don't have an updated revenue estimate. And I will tell you, it's not something that hadn't happened in the past. In 1986, the Comptroller of Public Accounts at that point was a guy named Bob Bullock. And he revised the revenue estimate when there was an economic downturn that created a lot of problems in the budget. So we don't really know. But most folks right now are saying it's going to be in the neighborhood of $20 billion. We'll have to wait and see what that number really is. The question that a lot of folks ought to be asking is, how did we get here? Now, we have a tough economic time. But in my view, it's not entirely an economic problem. Over the past decade, roughly 10 years, Texas has, in my view, increasingly relied upon different practices that have put us in this situation. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those. The first practice was what I refer to as the tax shift of 2006 that has created a part of the problem that we face in our budget. In 2006, the legislature, and I wasn't in the legislature at the time, but the legislature created what is now generally referred to as part of the structural deficit in the budget. It's now, and by the way, the phrase structural deficit is now a common part of budget discussion, the idea that we have a structural deficit. What happened was there was a special session in 2006, and the special session was called in part as a result of the Texas Supreme Court declaring the school finance system unconstitutional. And I won't go into all the details about why, but there was a need to deal with the school finance system. When the legislature convened in 2006, it did a couple of things. One thing it did is it said we're going to have a property tax reduction. Property taxes that were in part paying for our school finance system. We're going to have a property tax reduction. It was around $14 billion in property tax reduction. Well, when there was the reduction of that revenue, there wasn't a reduction of services. Instead, it was just a reduction in revenue. But there was a need to deal with that reduction. Where do we get the money? If we're going to reduce $14 billion in property taxes and needed property tax cuts and needed property tax relief for folks, how is that going to be replaced? And what the legislature did is really three things to come up with revenue. The first thing it did is it increased the cigarette tax by an amount. The second thing it did is it created what is now referred to or was referred to then and continues to be, as the liar's affidavit. And what that boiled down to is if you buy a used car and you have to pay sales tax on that purchase, you now have to pay Blue Book value as opposed to just saying, I only paid $1,000 for it, that kind of thing. So it's called a liar's affidavit. And then the third thing that occurred was the state created the new business tax, what some people refer to, and probably more people think of, as the so-called margins tax. So that's $14 billion in cuts, and then those three things to deal with revenue. What happened was those three things together, the margins tax or the new business tax, plus the cigarette tax and the money projected off the liar's affidavit, those were projected to raise, again, in the neighborhood of $8 billion per biennium. That's what the projection was. Now, I went to law school, so I didn't have to do math. But 14 minus 8, and again, I'm dealing in round numbers here, but 14 minus 8 created a deficit in money. 6, is that right? Yeah, 6. So around 6. But what's happened since that time is that the margins tax hasn't met even that promise, adding $1 billion to $2 billion to the so-called structural deficit. So we've got an issue there. You start off each budget cycle with a structural deficit. And by the way, we've recently been told that as a part of the economic downturn, what you have seen is you have seen a decrease in property values so that local school districts are going to be seeing less revenue. Well, under our school financing system, which requires, and I'm not going to get into all the complications of that, but what it requires is the state to pick up some of that when that occurs. If you already have a structural deficit, we see that the failure of that business tax to live up to its promise may create even additional problems down the road. And frankly, that's not being talked about that much right now about what we're going to be facing. But I anticipate that very early in the session, we're going to have to deal with our school finance program and how that plays out when you've had this reduction in property taxes. So the business model has built into it a structural deficit. The business model also, in my view, improperly diverts money. Here's what happens. Those in control promise that taxes and fees that are collected will be used for a specific purpose, but then those promises are broken, basically, is the way I would look at that. The state raises money for a dedicated cause. Many times it's something that's popular. For example, the state will say, hey, do you like parks? And people say, yeah, I like parks. And say, well, I'll tell you what if we were to take a portion of the sales tax on sporting goods, and we were to dedicate that to the Parks and Wildlife Department? Would you be okay with that? Well, sure, I'd be okay with that, because I like parks. Okay, well, that's what we'll do. So they create a piggy bank that's called a General Revenue Dedicated Fund for Parks and Wildlife. Hey, it gets hot in Texas in the summer. Yeah, it does. Wouldn't tell it today, but it gets hot. What do you think if in the deregulated parts of our electric utility market, now not so much in Austin, where not at all in Austin, where we're part of Austin Energy, but in the deregulated parts of the state, what would you think? Because in those hot months, people that are on senior citizens that are on fixed incomes and poor folks, they can't make their payments. What would you think if we put a small fee or tax or surcharge or whatever the politically correct term is, and we put it on your bill, and we collected that, and then in the hot summer months we used it to help people pay their electric bills that need it? Oh, well, I'm for that. How could I not be for that? Okay, well, we'll do that, and we'll put it in a fund that we call the System Benefit Fund. Got that piggy bank? Oh, should we be going after fugitives? Yeah, we need to catch the fugitives. Well, how about if we charge a small fee on some court filings and we have what we call the Fugitive Apprehension Fund? Folks, I could go on all day about different. What happens is all these piggy banks get collected. But then they don't, all that money doesn't get appropriated. Some of it does, but not all of it gets appropriated for its intended purpose. Instead, it's used to be a special piggy bank to certify the budget and to be able to certify that the budget will be balanced when they're spending. And that is getting worse. Back in around the 2000 to 2001 time frame, there was a little over $1 billion, about $1.3 billion, about $1.3 billion of money collected for a specific purpose that wasn't appropriated for that purposes. And it runs from trauma funds to system benefit fund, all this. At the end of this biennium, there will be $3.7 billion of money collected for a specific purpose, for a general revenue dedicated fund that is not then spent for that purpose. So the business model diverts money that is collected for a specific purpose to using it to balance the budget, to certify the budget, even though it was collected for a specific purpose. Now look, that weakness in the business model has been recognized by people other than me. And I've been talking about this for longer than just now. In fact, last session, I filed a bill that would have required that that practice be done in the light of day, that the public would know how much of the certified budget was set aside. We were using general revenue dedicated funds that weren't being appropriated for their dedicated purpose. And I didn't get a hearing on it. Couldn't get a hearing on it. So what happened was, toward the end of the session, there was a bill that was coming through, a pretty good-sized budget bill that was coming through, and I indicated to the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, who's a good guy and who I get along with great, and we talk about this stuff all the time, and I went to him and I said, Mr. Chairman, I want to amend your bill to require that there be more light of day on this. He ended up accepting my amendment. And when he accepted my amendment, here's what he said. He said, he, meaning me, makes a very valid point, and that is that we're unable to write an appropriations bill that would serve the needs of this state without relying to a fairly significant extent on surplus balances in our general revenue dedicated funds. In an ideal world, he said, those funds would be self-leveling in the sense that if we don't use it for the purpose for which it is intended, either the fees go down or the money gets refunded. And I would hope that the legislature would work in that direction. He went on to say, but it needs to be looked at in a comprehensive basis. And he went on to talk about some of the things that ought to be looking at our entire structure. And he ended by saying this, and this amendment, meaning my amendment, which will shine a light on that issue, doesn't need to be the end of the story. At the end of the story, the obvious answer is a tax overhaul in the state of Texas. We really have a pretty rickety system right now. So that's what the chairman said as he recognized this weakness in the business model that the state's operating under. But the business model has other inappropriate diversions. Despite our traffic needs in this state, motor fuels tax money is going for other purposes. The weakness in that business, and let me tell you how that works. You pay, every time you put a gallon of gas in your tank, you pay a fee, a tax to the state of Texas that's a motor fuels tax. Now, it looks like a sales tax because you're paying it at the time you do it, but it's not your typical sales tax. It's a percentage of the price of the product that you're paying for. It's a flat amount that you pay on every gallon of gas. And it's been the same amount since 1991. But it's a flat amount. That then goes into what is called Fund 6, and it's a big part of our that's the Fund 6 has other things in it, but that's the biggest part of what is in that part to pay for transportation improvements. Session after session, money is taken from that and used to spend on things other than transportation. Primarily, it's used to fund DPS, the Department of Public Safety. Now look, for session after session, people have been saying we need to stop doing that because we're strangling in mobility problems. We're relying far, far more, I think, on the hypocritical toll tax. And I think that, you know, a dollar you spend for a toll is the same as, it feels the same as you spend a dollar on motor fuels money. But that weakness has also been recognized. Back in August of '08, in anticipation of the '09 session, Governor Perry, Lieutenant Governor Dewhurst, and then Speaker Craddock, they wrote a letter. And in their letter, they recognized, quote, "Our state faces significant transportation funding challenges," close quote. And quote, "Our ability to fund needed transportation projects in the future is limited," end quote. So they committed to, and I'll quote this, quote, "implement a plan that sets a definitive course to end the practice of funding the Department of Public Safety with gas taxes that are needed for road construction and return to funding the DPS with general revenue," close quote. And in that session, more than $1 billion in gas tax money went to other purposes, because there is no plan on how, a definitive plan on how you're going to end those diversions. In my opinion, the business model also has, we get told that we're a state that doesn't rely upon debt, but more and more we're seeing, particularly in the area of transportation, that we're going from a pay-as-you-go state to a state that has debt being a part of the way we pay for our transportation improvements. But here's the thing. Up until now, the weaknesses that I've talked about in the business model have been masked. They've been able to be covered over. Frankly, I think we might have gone a biennium or two more had the economy not been the way it is and exposed a lot of these weaknesses. But let me give you an example of how they've otherwise been masked. At the time that the margins tax was created, there was also a fund created that was set up to be utilized in these sessions to cover the structural deficit. It had a great name. It was called the Property Tax Relief Fund. But it was money, billions of dollars, that was put, as I say, in a mattress. Now, that wasn't money that was paying for any roads. It wasn't paying for any public education. It wasn't paying for higher education. It wasn't paying for border security. It wasn't paying for water, our state water plan. It wasn't paying for any of those things. It was there so that it could be used to cover the gap. And then, of course, last session, there was stimulus money that was used. There was 12 billion, around 12 billion total in stimulus money that was used, but 6.4 was directly used to offset general fund obligations. And now one of the things that's being talked about is utilizing the Economic Stabilization Fund, which is really, we all call it the rainy day fund. The Economic Stabilization Fund to cover some of these problems, and in my view, that would be covering up some of the gap. So here we are. We have a disaster of a budget, but in my view, it's not entirely a natural disaster. It is one where there have been practices that have led us to having a big chunk of this shortfall. So what I've offered up is what I call my honesty agenda. And it's pretty simple, pretty basic, and pretty straightforward. First of all, we need to end the denial that we have a budget problem. We need to start reforming the failing system. We need to address our immediate needs in a way that will grow our economy. We need to enforce accountability and regain public trust. And we need to start providing the foundation for building prosperity for your generation and fixing problems as they arise. And what that's going to do is it's going to require us to take a broad systematic look at our budget and look at the problems. We're going to have to look at things, we're going to have to take the time to make sure that we engage in a long-term fix. I don't think you can do it every 2 years by engaging in a sprint for 140 days, which is the length of a legislative session. And we're going to have to involve a whole lot of people, a lot more than get involved in the budget process in the decisions that are going to require us to make some hard choices. And then I think we ought to require a plan by those in control and proof that that plan will work. We ought to have some priorities. We ought to prioritize human capital, skills, education, children, and long-term return. We ought to require a quantifiable return on investment. We ought to require accountability, measurable results that are comprehensible and allow for feedback on the way those work. And then recommendations we ought to require that people demonstrate they'll be viable and sustainable over the long term. So what is the honesty agenda? It has 3 parts to it. The first part is accountability. And I'll just give you some real quick thoughts on that. First, I think we ought to change the rules of the Senate. I think we ought to change the rules of the Senate to require that the final version of the budget, which is also known as the Conference Committee report, as well as any related summaries to that, lay out in public for at least 5 days before it's voted on, so that people will actually know what they're voting on. But in addition to that, the public will know what's in there. We'll have time for the media and others to look at that and be able to let the public know what's in it. I also think that we ought to have more information. We ought to hear more information in a timelier way about the fiscal condition of the state. I think the comptroller should have to provide more regular reports about the state's budget and its finances. The Legislative Budget Board, which is the legislature's budget overseer during the 4/5 of the biennium that we're not in a legislative session, should have to formally receive those reports and to physically meet and receive input from everyday Texans before major systematic changes, such as across-the-board spending cuts, could be made to the budget. I also think the comptroller shouldn't be allowed to issue short-term budget balancing debt unless the state's cash management committee, which consists of the top officials charged with overseeing the state's debt situation, it meets to receive up-to-date information about the state's finances and debt picture. Right now, I would argue those things are not occurring in a way that they should. And then I'm going to propose that any tax or fee, what I've indicated budget writers call general revenue dedicated funds, that these taxes and fees be suspended if they aren't paying for the specific cause that Texans were told they would go toward. The second part of my honesty agenda is a stability package. And in that, I'm going to argue that we ought to have reforms that will modernize state government and restore it so legislators and voters can have faith in major policy and budget decisions that will set the course of the state. I'm going to fight for use of greater technology. I had some bills last time, I had a bill last time that would have, I think, allowed for greater technology and the use of technology in people following the budget process. I'll work to also make sure that we don't have any laws that no law can take effect if there's no money to pay for it. And I think we ought to crack down on what I consider to be reckless, something-for-nothing governance, where if people can score fleeting political points by eliminating revenue that the state relies on without declaring in an open and honest way what functions and necessities would be eliminated so that the public will know what gets cut. I'll also work to end unfunded mandates that don't actually save the taxpayers as much money as some people might say they do, but instead just shift the obligations away from state to local government. And I'll require honesty about legislative decisions that turn our backs on your tax dollars that are going to the federal government that ought to be coming back so that they can be used. We deserve to get that money back. And we ought to know what the details are about what it costs us when we turn our back on that federal money. And then finally, as the third part of the honesty agenda, I want to make sure that those that are in charge set out a path for cleaning up these fiscal issues and building a responsible, truthful, and in my opinion, truly moral state budget. Part of what I'm calling for there is that what we do is we bring in other folks. Let's bring in the best business minds in the state, folks that have to be fiscally responsible to run their businesses, folks that know what it means to keep up-to-date revenue estimates, and know what it means for the future of the state to make the kind of investments that I referred to a moment ago that are patently good for Texans and for the future of the Texas economy. I think we ought to be rebuilding the budget from scratch, from the ground up. and prioritize things as we go along so that we assure, as I indicated a minute ago, taxpayers get a return on their investment and they reflect our shared values, and they position Texas to be an economic powerhouse in this century the way we were in the last century. Now with that, I'll tell you, I think these are pretty basic reforms. I don't think there's anything partisan about them. I think, as was indicated in the introduction, that what's happened is, over time, habits create scar tissue. And it's sometimes difficult for those habits to be broken and to dig through the dense scar tissue of our budgeting process. I believe we can do it. I do believe it will take more than one legislative session to pull it off. But in my view, as I indicated, right now, I think there is great exposure of some of our failings in our budget system. This fiscal crisis offers us an opportunity, if we'll take it, and that opportunity is to ask, how do we start building a budget that is sustainable over the long haul and invests in your future in a way that we owe to you? And with that, why don't I be quiet, and I'll answer any questions, but I'm glad to be with you all today. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes.
Senator Watson, thank you so much for coming to UT. The first half of your speech is a little bit disheartening, hearing all the structural problems that we have with the budget. And the second half of your speech is a little bit wanting, in that a lot of the things that you propose are process-oriented, but you don't give us any indications of what you think needs to be changed along policy lines to help rectify the first half of your speech. So if you could just speak a little bit to policy instead of process.
Well, if I understand your question, part of the problem we've got is when you don't know, it makes it very difficult. I'll be real straightforward with you. I'm not going to vote for a budget that has any new taxes or fees in it absent process reforms. And the reason for that is I can't promise you as my constituent that the money that is utilized for any of those new taxes or fees will go to its purpose. And until we have that sort of process reform, then I'm not going to vote for that. I'm also not going to vote to tap the rainy day fund until we have real meaningful reform. And the reason for that is because I can make an argument to you right now that a thing called the Economic Stabilization Fund, that our economy is in such a situation, I'd be a very good advocate for the argument that a portion of that Economic Stabilization Fund should be utilized to deal with some of the economic instability that we have. But if it's instead used, if your savings account is instead used simply to mask over structural problems, then I don't know what you do, to get to your point about policy, I don't know what you're going to do in 2013 and 2015. As I started this speech, I said it's becoming harder and harder to stably balance the budget, and therefore harder and harder to plan for the future. I also think that if you look at cuts and you don't do that with some idea about the reforms, where you can talk about what are the values behind those cuts, you find yourself making decisions, trying to fill gaps that it doesn't always work out. I'll give you an example. If you look at higher education, I'm a big proponent of higher education. If you look at the 5% across, so-called across-the-board cuts, and by the way, our government talks about that way a lot. They talk about how in 2003, you would think that in 2003 it was done with just cuts. Well, one of the things that we know that happened in 2003 is that college tuition was, quote, deregulated, or as some people say, made more flexible. Well, people will tell you that there has been an appropriation decrease per student in the state over that period of time, while on average tuition has gone up across the state. Well, so we shifted the burden to a lot. So you can't even get to the cuts until you have the reforms. But you can't even get to the cuts or any aspect of it until you know what the whole is. And that's part of the symptom of the problem, is we wait until January because nobody's going to tell us what the real numbers are. Only then can you get into some of the policy discussions. Otherwise, you're just kind of shooting. But that's part of the reason I think the the process has to come first. Yes, sir.
Senator Watson, I believe the newspaper today said that Jim Pitts has already been talking about the budget over in the House, and he made a statement to a group yesterday there's going to be massive cuts. I'm assuming the same discussions are happening among at least some people in the Senate. Can you give us some of the highlights of what we're liable to see when we have these billions of dollars cut from the state budget?
Well, one of the things that Chairman Pitts has talked about is in the area of health and human services. Let me kind of come at it from this point of view. When we talk about the state budget, you have one big budget, but it has two parts, is the way I think of it. You have the all funds budget. The all funds budget is a budget that is everything from sales tax to all the fees that are collected, all the general revenue dedicated funds, every aspect, federal money, it's all money, marbles, and chalk. And that budget is somewhere over $180 billion. Then you have the other part that I think of is you have the general fund budget. The general fund budget is, the biggest part of the state budget in terms of revenue is sales tax. But the general fund budget is about 80. It's in excess of 80, somewhere between 80 and probably 87 billion. The bulk of that budget is public education and health and human services. So when you start talking about where you make cuts, those are two of the first places that I think you'll anticipate seeing where cuts will be made. You've heard a lot of talk about Medicaid. The federal health care legislation that has recently passed says that the state can't do some things that we saw happen in 2003 where eligibility requirements were changed for children and people that are on Medicaid. And by the way, our state it's pretty hard to be on Medicaid, to get onto Medicaid in our state. And so it's not that there's a whole lot there to begin with, but one of the things that some people anticipate will happen, and I've not seen specifically what Chairman Pitts talked about, but one of the things that some people have indicated might happen is that the reimbursement would go down, meaning that some folks wouldn't take Medicaid patients because they couldn't be reimbursed. And that would be everything from doctors that currently take Medicaid patients to nursing homes. So when you start talking about the cuts, two of the first places that I think people will anticipate looking will be in the area of public education and in the area of health. But I don't think we should stop, we should anticipate that it stops there. Higher education is one that, frankly, I think we already saw. I was going to say, I got distracted on my own answer a minute ago. The 5% across the board cuts that we just talked about, when that was done, certain things were put off limits. Education, that kind of thing was put off limits. They talk about it as though it's across the board. But certain things were put off limits. Well, then when the cuts all came in, then they went in, a few people went in and said, okay, well now we're going to restore this. So I've just given you some numbers, and 5%, you can do the math on that, but the total cuts ended up being just somewhere north of $1 billion, $1.2 billion, somewhere north of there. But here's what was interesting about that. If you look at the percentage that higher education makes up of the total general revenue budget, it picked up a much greater share of those cuts, those so-called 5% across the board cuts. Much greater share than its percentage of the revenue or of the budget, and much more than 5%. So I think you can also anticipate that higher ed will be one of those areas that will be cut. Other questions, thoughts?
Senator, did they change at the federal level on Medicaid? We still get Matching dollar for dollar?
Well, it's not dollar for dollar, it's actually better than that. And under the federal health care bill, parts of that will kick in later, that goes up. Let me talk a minute about part of what I was talking about a minute ago. You raised a question that I ought to give a little more clarity on. The Children's Health Insurance Program, for example. One of the things I was talking about is that I think we ought to be looking at what federal money we're entitled to and whether we ought to be turning our back on that federal money. The Children's Health Insurance Program is a program where for every dollar that the state puts up, it gets matched by, you get different figures on this, but roughly $2.65, somewhere in that neighborhood. So for every dollar, the federal government will send back in excess of $2.60 to the state. And when I say sends back, I really mean it, because it's money that we sent up there, right? So we ought to get that back. What the economists tell me is that if you take that money, that now $3.60 plus cents, and you put it into existing businesses in Texas, things that we call health clinics, hospitals, places like that, what occurs is that spins through the economy, and at least one economist has told me that ends up being over $7. So you get that kind of return on your investment. The state of Texas hasn't fully funded the Children's Health Insurance Program, so that what doesn't happen is you don't get all of that money back. Part of what I talk about in terms of reform, when you start talking about how you do things and where you're going to make your cuts, when you get into the policy of it, ought to be that we look at return on investment. It might be that you want to make that dollar investment because of the return on investment that we get. And by the way, if you don't spend that dollar, that didn't make any kid healthier. Children will still get sick that will need to go to Brackenridge Hospital or some health clinic, and somehow that has to be paid for. And typically the way that gets paid for is in local property taxes, like Central Health, our healthcare district. So, yes, there are a number of programs where you put up money and you get a match back, Medicaid and CHIP being two of those. Folks, you got a question back there? Let me do one more question.
Well, just adding on to the same thing about the CHIP, the Women's Health Program
Absolutely.
is up for cancellation or reinvigoration. And is it, I mean, the only silver lining one can see is that the budget pressure could trump ideology on some of these things, but is that wishful thinking?
Well, I hope not. I hope that, if I understand what it is you're saying, I hope that what we will do, and part of what I'm trying to push here, is process reform where you actually force, to some degree, that those questions be asked and then answered. And so that perhaps there will be situations where people will see that there is value in making certain types of investments that maybe before they weren't willing to make. I mean, you bring up a program, and I'm gonna forget what the match is, but it's better than what I was just talking about with, yeah, that was my memory too, but I worry about not being exactly right on that. But it's more than the CHIP match, and more than what Medicaid has been pre-federal, the recent federal health care legislation. And Health and Human Services, the Texas Health and Human Services, has also put out reports about what sort of return you get on that. So my hope is that if we will do the process in the right way, that those kind of questions will ultimately be asked and answered in a way where we can have less debate about certain types of ideology and more debate about what's good for Texans.